Okay, so now I know we have already like 5 minutes after 12. I think it's time right for us to start our blockchain at UBC monthly research talk after our lovely summer break. And it's our great honor, right, to have Professor Andrew Ha with us as our first speaker to kick off this event in our new academic year. And for those maybe like who are unfamiliar with me, I'm a co-class lead of blockchain at UBC. My research areas are in information theory and coding theory with applications to blockchain technology. And in my research field, there is a tradition that is the more famous a speaker is, the less we will introduce, because we believe, right, everyone already like knows, right, and this is big, and that's why I will follow the tradition today, right, and I will give a short introduction and to Professor Andrew Ha, and he is a full professor of political economy in the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. And he is also a full professor of political science. In addition, he is an advisor to technical companies, startups, and blockchain protocols on the issues at the intersection of like society, technology, and governance. That's why, right, as Chang pointed out, it's the ideal type of speaker, and we want to have at blockchain at UBC events. And then maybe one last thing, his CV is truly amazing, right? If you want to know more about Professor Andrew Ha, let me share the link, and you will be deeply impressed as I was when I was reading his CV. Okay, and without further ado, and let's invite Professor Ha and for his talk. I very look forward to it.
Thank you. No, I'm super excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really excited to talk to this group. And couldn't agree any more strongly on the idea that getting together a group of people across disciplines on this topic is so valuable. Obviously, from my perspective as a humble political scientist, getting to understand the technical side of blockchain and decentralized governance is so valuable for me. And was very delighted that you invited me, and very happy to be here. And I'll just note, first, I'll note two things at the beginning. One, this is not really a traditional research talk in the sense that it's more about research that I want to do in the future, but I'll lead with a bunch of ideas about decentralized governance and how it relates to governance in the physical world that we know something about. Second thing I'll just note, since we're on Zoom, please feel free either to drop any questions in the chat, which I'll do my best to monitor. Also, don't hesitate if you just want to actually interrupt me. I'm very happy with that too. We actually do quite a lot of voice interruption in political science, which I actually think is a nice way to spark a conversation. So feel free to jump in any way that you want. And let me get started. So I'm going to talk today about decentralized governance, what it is, and how nascent it is in Web3, and how we might build it out more, using lessons from the history of governance in the physical world. I want to start with a brief historical anecdote that I think is helpful as just kind of a story for thinking about why Web3 might be important. This is a famous painting or picture of the Declaration of Right. This is something that was called the Glorious Revolution in British history. The idea was basically that there had been a series of monarchs exerting sort of like increasingly unilateral powers over a lot of decisions that affected society. And there were a ton of dimensions to the Glorious Revolution. I'm not going to get into all the details, but one really important aspect of it, by no means the only, but an important aspect, was that James II he needed to raise money for all of his foreign entanglements. And to do so, he had squeezed money out of an increasingly reluctant set of wealth holders in the country by saying that he was in charge of determining sort of how loans worked and that he could pass any law that he wanted. And he said that basically you have to lend the crown money even if you don't want to. And so he passed a set of laws requiring the financing of his wars, and he dissolved parliament and said that basically there's no check on the authority of the monarch. This was obviously controversial, and it led to parliament conspiring to remove him from power and replace him with William and Mary. And in this picture here, what is happening is that Parliament is presenting the new rulers with a set of declarations about what the powers of Parliament are going to be, what their rights are. And there's a number of them, but the most important for this story that I want to tell is that they said, it's our job to determine how taxes work. It's our job to write the laws, and it is not the monarch's power to just kind of like, tell us when and how we have to pay taxes or lend to the crown money. And this turned out to be really important. There's an extremely famous piece of research by a colleague of mine here in political science, Barry Weingast, and Douglas North, who was a Nobel Prize winning economist in this area. It was about how the Glorious Revolution, by decentralizing power and by creating this credible system where a group of wealth holders, a still very narrow slice of society, but a group of wealth holders had to agree to give the crown money, that this decentralization led to a big increase in the willingness of people with money to make loans to the crown, and actually led to a much more mature financial system where people were willing to transact with the crown and with each other because they believed, in a way they hadn't before, that their interests were being reflected in the governance process. And so the idea wasn't just that they thought it would, make better decisions or whatever. The idea was that they believed, in a way they hadn't before, that if they lent money to the crown, that the crown couldn't change the rules later and say, actually, we've decided we're going to pay you less interest, or actually, we've decided we're not going to pay you at all. And that insight has been really important in the study of governance in general, that basically different sets of rules or different governance systems that reflect different people's interests can lead to higher levels of trust and therefore to higher levels of economic activity, and even maybe to a larger sense of legitimacy of the system. That was sort of like something we've learned over time, not just from the Glorious Revolution, but from a number of historical episodes like this. The idea that by decentralizing power, by limiting central authority, you might actually be able to get more people to contribute to the system because they believe that their interests are protected in governance. That's been a kind of a fundamental view in the study of political economy for a while now. And I think it's relevant, even though obviously it's a historical story, I think it's relevant to Web3 and to decentralized governance more generally. Because if you look at what's happened online, we're in some sense reliving history, obviously in a new way. But we're reliving history in the sense that a bunch of different services in what we might call Web 2 have become incredibly successful, and they've, by delivering products that people value, they've become incredibly successful, and they've almost like accidentally become a little bit like a monarchy in the sense that each of them gets to set all of its own rules, above and beyond, of course, legal regulations, set their own rules with not a ton of input from the people affected by the rules. And so they're a little bit like the story I was telling prior to the Glorious Revolution. Now, there might be tons of cases where this makes sense. In particular, if you're a business, you're trying to operate nimbly in a complex environment. We don't necessarily want every online organization to have an incredibly cumbersome, sort of parliamentary style government. However, there might be two particular values to doing at least some decentralization of power in these large online communities, particularly right when they're very large, when there aren't a lot of outside options for the people who are subject to the rules of the platform. And those two values would be, one, that you might be able to create more social legitimacy by creating a process that reflects, that creates rules that reflects the interests of the people affected by them. And second, kind of like the story I was talking about, the Glorious Revolution, that you might actually encourage a bunch of economic activity if you convince creators and developers and sellers and users that if they come and they participate on your platform, there's actually a process that's not only going to make them a good offer today, like, we're going to pay you well for your time for your product today, but that actually it's going to make this long-term promise to you that however this platform evolves, it's going to be consistent with your interests because you're part of the governance of the platform. That, I think, is like an essential idea. And those two reasons together, kind of generating social legitimacy and causing economic growth through more kind of investment from all of those different groups onto a platform, those, I think, are key promises of decentralized governance that are kind of in the background of what I want to talk about today. That's like the goal. And then the question is, how do you actually make that work? How do you get all of these different people's interests reflected by an effective governance system? And I've already kind of hinted at the fact that in reality, we know that democratic systems are extremely messy and cumbersome. They're incredibly important and valuable, but you don't want everything to operate through democracy because it's slow and it encourages disagreements. You want to use it in a really thoughtful and smart way. And so what I want to talk about today from almost like a constitutional engineering perspective is how do you actually make decentralized governance for DAOs or for other types of online organizations actually work? And a big theme of what I'm going to try to convince you of today is that making it work, allowing communities of people online to govern themselves effectively, is likely to require the smart use of what I would call indirect democracy. That is where people have representatives that are tasked with reflecting their interests within a system. So that's what I want to talk about today. Let me just very quickly explain who I am, so why I'm talking about this. And the introduction, which was far over kind to me, but I appreciate it, kind of hinted at this. Like I mostly study elections with a particular focus in the US. And so I mostly study how you construct effective systems of democratic governance for the physical world. But over the last 5 years, originally starting with doing some work in social media related to the concerns about how social media has affected elections, I ended up becoming very interested in this idea that actually how social media companies affect elections is one instance of a broader question, which is about how we govern these online platforms to try to help them come to better rather than worse decisions, and to create sets of rules and algorithms and systems that lead to kind of societally good outcomes. And so over the last 5 years, I've ended up doing a lot of work in that space. And in particular, I've become super interested, based on my background in part, on how you can leverage the tools of democracy to let communities govern themselves online, but to do it in a realistic way that might actually kind of, actually work. And a lot of the ideas I'm going to talk about in today's talk come from that piece, which I think was, it's pasted into the chat, that Porter Smith and I wrote together on the history of governance and how it might be useful to Web3. And so I want to talk about, now let me get into kind of the meat of this. I want to talk about 3 particular problems that we're already seeing manifest in the governance of online organizations in Web3, and point out that all 3 are kind of very, very long-running problems in democracy. So the first, which probably is the number one thing people bring to me when they want to talk about DAOs in particular or Web3 in general, is this idea of poor participation. There's just not that many people voting. I'm going to show you a little bit of data on that. And that's, of course, a classic problem in democracies that has been solved in a number of ways, but is still obviously a huge problem. The second is what I call interest group capture. That's what political scientists would typically call it. This is the idea that it's very related to the first problem. If you don't have a lot of people participating, and you rely on a voting-driven system to make decisions, then that opens the door to small groups of people with very, very strong interests in whatever decisions are being made, influencing the process, because they're the ones who benefit a lot from certain decisions going one way or another, and they're not checked by a large number of other people whose interests are different from theirs, because those other people aren't participating. So this is sometimes, this is partially a collective action problem. And it's, again, something we're seeing in DAOs at some frequency already, and probably, if DAOs continue to proliferate and become larger, it's sure to happen more often. The third is a little bit different from the first two, but it's closely related. And this is the problem that, like, you're not actually voting on everything. You need people to do stuff on a day-to-day basis. There's like work to be done, and voting is one part of the system, but then there's also these, essential contributors. If it's a large DAO, there could be like a workforce, like MakerDAO, for example, has a pretty large workforce. It's an example I'm going to revisit. One way or another, you have a set of token holders who are voting on things, and then you have a set of people, some of whom may be token holders, who are doing things on a day-to-day basis. And how do you keep the incentives of those two groups aligned? That's a super classic problem in governance, not just in democracies, in all governance. In politics, we would call it the bureaucracy. How do you get the bureaucracy to take actions that are in line with what the token holders want? And those three, there are of course other problems, but these three problems are really, really core. And I want to just point out, back to the motivation, that if you don't design a system that solves these three problems, you're not going to have that sense of social legitimacy, because you don't actually have decisions being made by the people being affected by the decisions. You might have a process that's supposed to represent those people, but if they're not participating, or if the process is captured by interest groups, or if the people implementing the decisions on a day-to-day basis aren't reflecting those interests, then you haven't actually created that legitimacy. And by the same token, you won't get the economic benefits of a good revolution in governance if you don't set this up right, for the same reason. Like, if I'm a creator and I'm concerned about joining this platform because I think the platform is going to expropriate me later, and you tell me, oh, well, we have this great governance process that reflects your interests, but then I discover that in fact none of the other creators ever vote, and a small group of people with concentrated interests that are averse to mine are making a lot of decisions, that won't reassure me. And so you need to solve these problems to actually get the gains from the promise of decentralized governance. So let me take each of these problems in turn. As I said, the first really well-known problem, I'm not telling anyone who's spent any time with DAOs already knows this is a big problem, but the first problem is not that many people vote. And we can kind of all take that on faith. I think if you've spent time in this part of the world, you already know it's a problem, but just to give you a little bit of a sense of data, this is just a sample. I want to emphasize, this is not comprehensive data. Dan Bonet, my colleague here in computer science, and I are working with two really awesome master's students to put together a dashboard that's going to show you a bunch of governance information about DAOs. And one of the things it's going to show across as many DAOs as possible is going to be, what is the average participation rate? So pooling across all of these different proposals that the DAOs are voting on, what is the average rate at which token holders are voting? And so I'm showing it for only 5 DAOs here. The dashboard's going to have many more than 5. This is what was available at the time I made this graph. We're still a few weeks away from having all the data together. But already you can see the rates are very low. So the highest rate here is from Nouns DAO. And I'm actually I'm gonna talk a little bit about that, because I think it's super interesting that Nouns DAO has the highest rate. But even there, we're at something like 17 or 18%. So that's, the majority, a large majority of all the tokens are not voting. And then you can see in the other DAOs here, Compound, Gitcoin, Pool Together, Uniswap, much lower rates. And if you were to look at other DAOs, I think we'll see even lower rates for many of them. Now, depending on what you're trying to do, this may not be a problem. I think you could definitely say that there's lots of instances where kind of abstruse technical decisions are being made, and there's lots of token holders who aren't interested in or informed about those issues. Maybe it's good that they're not voting. I think there's definitely something to be said for that. But if you don't do something to get participation up, and particularly informed participation, you're going to worry about instances where decisions are made that are not good or that are adverse to some of the other token holders voting. I just want to note, now if we think about like, well, how do you get participation to increase? It's interesting to see that nouns is higher, because one of the things we think in the social sciences, right, is that voting is in part a collective action problem, that my personal vote has very little effect on the outcome if there's lots of people voting and I don't have a ton of voting power. And so why not sit back and let other people figure out what the right answer is? And one of the solutions to that, we've always thought, is that when you're in a small enough group that you actually have real social cohesion around the act of voting. That's one condition under which we tend to see higher turnout. And then the other is when you have a lot at stake in the outcome, that sort of like behaviorally that leads you to want to vote more. And those are two things that I think nouns is kind of in an interesting place on. It's relatively small, right? You have to hold a noun to vote. There aren't that many nouns, and it's a community with a lot of kind of like, community spirit. And so it's interesting to see that participation is higher there. And I think there's probably learnings for other DAOs to be had from nouns. So I want to note, because this is a super long running issue, that the challenge of getting people to participate in elections goes back to the dawn of elections. So it predates tech for sure, but it also predates blockchain within tech. And I think this is an anecdote that I actually was not aware of this at the time it occurred. And I've noticed that a lot of people today are not aware that it did occur. And I found it to be a really helpful example to go back to, because it reminds us about different ways in which history repeats itself. In 2009, there was a kind of a blow up about some of the Facebook community standards. Now, I should know I do some work with Facebook. I did not in 2009 though. And they made this very interesting decision to have the community, the global Facebook user base at the time, vote on which of two draft sort of like community standards would go into effect. And the idea was right along the lines, I think, of the motivation I gave in terms of social legitimacy. The idea was, if you're going to be in part of this huge online community, and we're going to have to make decisions about who's allowed to say what, then it might not be legitimate for the company to unilaterally make those decisions. It's supposed to be a community of users online. Shouldn't they make those decisions for themselves? So I think it's a very plausible, sort of logical idea, but it has the same challenge that I was just showing in the DAO space, which is that, I'm just gonna skip over this, which is that very, very few people actually want to take the trouble to become informed about this thorny and quite complex issue. The draft community standards were many, many pages long and like kind of legalistic. And so in the end, almost no one voted. It's 600,000 people voted, which is actually a lot of people. But as a share of the global user base, even in 2009, when Facebook was a lot smaller than it is today, it was a small fraction. It's a 3/10 of a percentage point. Which is not nothing, but and it's actually in line with the turnout rates that some DAOs are seeing. But it's not at the level we would want to be able to say something like, this is a socially legitimate decision that like the community has made as a whole. Now, you could have situations where 3/10 of a percentage point of people voting is representative of the community, right? For example, if we randomly sampled those 600,000 people, and we convinced them all to vote, that would be reflective of the community as a whole. But of course, the challenge in these voting systems, and this is a big challenge DAOs have, is of course it's not random. And it's in fact systematically, right? The people who are going to show up and vote are going to be very different from the people who don't. In some ways, that could be a very good thing. They could be much more informed and care more. But it could be a bad thing if, for example, they have a different set of priorities or goals than the people who are not voting yet also hold tokens. And so that's to say, kind of low turnout rate is not in and of itself the problem, but it becomes a problem if you think, for example, you're trying to set rules to affect a global community and you worry that the people voting to make the rules are super unrepresentative of the community that's going to be affected by the rules. Okay, so this should not really be a surprise to anyone. We know that it's not rational for people to vote in some kind of pretty general sense. This is called the paradox of voting in political science. And we know some of the problems that it causes. I've already kind of laid those out. And where I think we should predict things would head if the physical world and the history of voting systems teaches us anything that's relevant to Web3 is towards indirect democracy. And this is precisely what we're seeing through delegation in DAOs. And so I just want to take a moment just to suggest that, like, this is not historically surprising. There has been this, enormous evolution spanning many hundreds of years in corporate governance towards delegation. So this is, the British East India Company was one of the first enterprises that was organized along these principles, not to very good ends, but the organizing principles are relevant for other types of organizations because it was actually in some ways very similar to Web3 in the sense that you have a bunch of people investing in an enterprise, but unable to monitor the day-to-days of the enterprise. There were enough investors that it did not make sense to ask them to vote on every decision. But at the same time, you don't want to leave them out of the governance process because you worry that the day-to-day management will then do things like steal money from the people who invested. And so you have it starts in corporate governance kind of around the same time period that it starts in political governance too, this idea that, well, there should be a smaller group of people whose job it is to represent the larger set of voters. And that's where you see the evolution of corporate boards, who are in some sense elected by shareholders. How effective those elections are even today is up for debate. But nevertheless, the formal idea is the shareholders elect a small set of people whose job it is to oversee the people doing the day-to-day work in the enterprise. And of course, we've seen that in governments all across the world as well. And so this is just I'm American. This is kind of from American history, the Constitutional Congress, the idea that it was impractical to ask everyone to vote on everything. In part, in the US case, and this is similar to previous historical cases, that was because it was literally geographically not practical for everyone to show up somewhere. And so they tried to design a system where a smaller set of people are asked to go and represent their constituents on important decisions that are being made. And I think we're already seeing a little bit of this in Web3. And I think if decentralized governance is to continue to be a part of blockchain, which I think it has to be, it's going to have to go in this direction. Because if there's one thing we're just very confident about from the history of voting systems is that there's just no way to scale systems that ask for everyone to vote on everything. And so I want to talk now about 3 particular ways to strengthen the very, very nascent kind of growth of indirect democracy that we're seeing in Web3. And I think hopefully these are all, again, very political sciencey ideas, but my hope is to convince people that they could be useful and actually, ideally to get people to kind of develop the underlying technology that would be required to implement these in terms of smart contracts. And so the 3 paths I want to talk about, just keeping my eye on time here. The first is recruiting people to be delegates, to be representatives within these systems, who are kind of qualified to do the job and who are given strong incentives to want to do a good job. And this, I'll talk about kind of what I mean by that in a little bit. The second is to design systems that represent all of the important different groups, communities, voices that we want represented. And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about moving beyond token voting, some of the stuff Vitalik has advocated for, and so forth. And then the third is that problem of oversight that I kind of alluded to earlier, which is how do you build the system? How do you take these pieces, delegates, other types of representatives, and get them to oversee what's going on in a decentralized organization in a way that generates trust between everyone? So I'm going to talk about that. Those are the three things that I think are kind of essential. All right. I just saw, I see just a couple questions I've seen in the chat so far. Let me pause for a moment here. On the data, I don't have a link yet, but I will in the next few weeks, so please stay tuned. On this question about liquid democracy, yes, I'm going to get into that. I think that's a really, really interesting kind of indirect democracy. And it's particularly interesting to me because one of the things that's excites me about Web3 as a space is this idea that you can take principles or learnings from other governance systems, but implement them in different and potentially newer, better ways because of what the technology facilitates. So I will mention liquid democracy in a little bit. And I guess that in a way that sort of answers this next question, because I think DAOs are not only reinventing the wheel is my hope. I do sometimes get the feel that they're heading towards reinventing corporate governance in the sense of shareholder voting. But I think that the technology facilitates stuff that could be quite different. And so I think that it'll be really interesting to see where it heads. But I think the question that really animates me in the space is, where is the new technology genuinely different and additive? And where is it actually the old methods are the right ones? And I think there's a mix of the two going on. Okay, so delegation is implemented in a small number of DAOs. Maker is I think almost certainly the largest that does it in a kind of a robust fashion. Even where it's been done, it's very, very new. Not that many tokens have been delegated. This will be, by the way, another part of the dashboard that we're going to release will be to show kind of the rates of delegation for the DAOs that are using it. Oftentimes what you will see also is not really fitting with this kind of vision of like representative democracy, in the sense that oftentimes what it is a small number of people with a lot of tokens, like VCs and founders, are doing a lot of the delegating. And so it's like, I think it's still potentially a very useful thing, but it's different from a model where it's like, I'm an individual voter, I don't know what's going on, so I delegate to a representative who's more informed than me. That would be a different type of delegation that we're not seeing as much yet, but I think we'll see more of if the system succeeds. And I think a major challenge we've seen so far with the delegates themselves is that since it's all new, they're not always sure kind of what their role in the process is. And this is something that's been debated, I think, in a really interesting way at Maker, is kind of like, is a delegate's job largely to vote on proposals that other people are making, or are they supposed to kind of steer the ship a bit more and make, kind of like bring the community together to design a vision and to implement new proposals and kind of have a larger role? That's sort of like, if it's going to become a mature governance process, something that's necessary, but not clearly where it's headed so far. And so you put these things together and you compare it to mature representative systems, I think the thing that you really need, which is not that easy to generate, is this idea of what we call in political economy accountability. And there are these, old, very kind of classic models of what that means mathematically. The idea is that I, as a delegate, I'm going to take a set of actions because I'm thinking ahead to how my token holders are going to react to my decisions. And so in the physical world, it would be, I want to do X, Y, and Z because I want to win re-election. Here, it's like, I want to do X, Y, and Z because I want to continue to have my these tokens delegated to me, or I want to even, get more people to delegate their tokens to me. And those two things can be very similar. They create, if you get it right, they can create this really beneficial, virtuous cycle where, let's suppose you you as a delegate have stronger incentives. You really want to keep this job. You like this job. It rewards you in whatever ways, you care about. So you really want to stay a delegate. You want to get as many people to delegate to you as possible. So you're going to do a better job. And then because you're doing a better job, people are going to be happier with the system. The system is going to succeed more. And that's going to lead other people, other token holders, to want to lean into the system more, pay more attention, care about who their delegate is, because they feel like this is a system that actually works for them. And because they are paying more attention and making good decisions about who to delegate their tokens to, that's going to increase the incentives for delegates to do a good job, because now they're thinking, okay, these token holders are really paying attention. If I don't do a good job, they're going to delegate to someone else. And so it's the two things kind of hang together. You need both the delegates to really want to be delegates and to stay delegates, and you need voters to really believe in what they're doing and pay attention to make informed decisions about who to delegate to. And if you have both of those things, you can create a very effective system of accountability. But if you don't have those things, of course, you don't get there. And I think that is kind of where we're at in these super nascent systems of delegation, is that we need to, if we want it to work this way, people have to really want to become delegates. And so part of that is pay. That's one part of it, of course. Like if they're going to do a lot of work, you probably want them to be compensated well for their time. Otherwise, it's just not realistic for people to do this. But it's definitely not just or even primarily about their pay. It's also about kind of like what the job is. Like, is it something that's prestigious that you want to do, that kind of like, is valued within your community, and also maybe is something that like creates a career path for you in this space? Are you empowered to actually like accomplish the things that we need governance to accomplish? So, in the physical world, we often look to like, what kind of capacity do you have? And so that could be things like resourcing for staff. Like maybe you need to study these super complex governance problems that a large entity is facing. So are you given what you need to actually succeed in the job? And then of course, as we get more regulatory clarity, can you be a delegate in a way that doesn't leave you personally open to liability is obviously important. And so if we can do those things, we can make it a job that people really want to have. Then if we have something like liquid democracy, let's say, something where you have token holders delegating, vigorously to the people they think are doing a good job, and undelegating from the people they think aren't doing a good job, then you really start to have that flywheel where you'll get competition, to be a really good delegate, and then we're kind of off to the races. I think the big question there, then, moving to the second chunk here in the slide, is sort of like, well, how do you get voters to actually do that? How do you get token holders to kind of actively move around their delegations and make, in response to the performance of their delegates? And so liquid democracy is a super interesting idea because it facilitates this very continuous feedback mechanism where I can constantly be kind of evaluating which representative are doing a good job and rewarding them with my delegated tokens. But there might be a sort of like a behavioral impediment here, which is that it might ask a lot of the token holders to be reevaluating on somewhat frequent basis, kind of like who they want to delegate to. And it might also create some uncertainty among the representatives who maybe I get a bunch of tokens delegated to me. I want to lead in, I want to think about what's the next 12 months in this organization look like, and what are the big governance priorities. But if at any moment I can be fired, that's both a good thing because it might, make me really want to do a good job. But it might also be a bad thing in the sense that it might leave me a little bit less willing to make long-run investments because I'm not sure how long I'm going to be in the job for. And if we think that token holders are really, really smart and really paying a lot of attention and very forward-looking, something like pure liquid democracy might work really well. But if we worry that in the short run, the token holders, kind of like voters sometimes do, can get kind of swept up in thinking that a particular policy is the right decision, that later they're going to find out is not the right decision, then we may not want, it's kind of like liquid democracy is like having an election every day. And that sometimes could be very good, but we worry that it could also be very bad if I think to myself, I, as a delegate or representative, I kind of know that this thing that's popular today is actually a really bad idea. And in a setting like that, we think it's actually good that that person has, let's say, a year or 2 years in office before they have to be elected again, because it allows them to balance kind of the short run urgency of what their constituents think they want with their like longer run interests. If you run an election every day, then you're basically saying whatever the voters want today is what we're going to do. And it depends a lot on the behavior of voters, whether you think that's going to lead to good or to bad outcomes. And so in some instances, you may want to consider a system where there's an aspect of liquid democracy in the sense that anyone can delegate to whoever they want, but where there are like fixed periods of time in which those delegations are locked. And so that would be a little bit akin to the way we do elections on some kind of defined time period, whether known in advance or, you know, like in the American system or not, like in some parliamentary systems. Either way, that there's some kind of like guaranteed amount of time that could be helpful both for getting delegates to invest more effort, but also it could have this interesting behavioral benefit, which is like if there are defined periods of time that are like election time, you might actually be able to create a lot of social attention around that time. And maybe it's, you know, twice a year, maybe it's 4 times a year, maybe it's once a year. It depends on the community, but by making it not all the time, you might actually be able to grab more people's attention and then show them kind of like, here are the people who've been delegates, here's what they've done, and kind of create that focal point that is helpful for participation. So those are kind of like key aspects here. There's a third thing I'm not going to get too deep on in the interest of time, but basically like, again, all of this only really we know in general voting systems really only hang together if voters are informed enough to make good delegation decisions. And so it's hard, and we know that asking them to vote on everything is not going to work, but even asking them to vote on delegates is hard. It's not impossible. We know from the real world it happens all the time, and it sometimes works pretty well. How do you kind of like create that baseline level of information in a DAO? You might want to like invest in some kind of like information provision resources that are sort of like a newspaper. I'm not going to get too deep in that because I want to make sure to finish the rest of my slides. Okay. The next part is about designing who is represented within the system. And if we think back to the motivations here around legitimacy and around economic activity, in both cases, I think you could argue that you want to make sure all of the affected interests are represented so that they believe in the system and they believe it's not going to expropriate them later or make bad decisions about, you know, kind of like related to their values, even if they're not large token holders. And there's definitely a trade-off here, because there's absolutely something to be said for any organization that, you know, that people with more at stake might have, you know, stronger incentives to be informed and to know what's going on. But at the same time, if we want to kind of scale these organizations and have them speak to these broader issues, we're going to have to think about making sure that all of the correct stakeholders are included. And so how do you do that? And of course, this is a debate even going on in corporate governance today in terms of like who beyond shareholders are important to represent through governance. And so, you know, if you look at these decentralized organizations, this is a very live and active debate. You know, Vitalik has been super outspoken about moving beyond token voting. There are lots of other groups who could be particularly important. There's the people who work for the protocol. There are other types of people that are actively contributing to the protocol in different ways. There's, of course, the users of the protocol. And then there's the people who hold tokens but are small token holders, and maybe because they're not pivotal in any of the votes, aren't really necessarily being reflected in the governance process. And of course, these are issues that we see in governments all over the world too. And that's part of why you don't see just straightforward kind of like everyone votes on everything type of designs. You often see designs that try to guarantee that different groups get a say in the process. And I'll just mention, because I think it's one of the most important ones in the physical world, a large chunk of the world in different ways tries to make the playing field level between men and women in how many people hold which seats in a government. And so this ranges from, there's like explicit quotas for candidates in some countries. There's reserved seats for women in a number of countries. There's quotas at the party level in some countries. That my point here is simply that a lot of societies have decided that if you just let the system roll, we get a kind of a super uneven distribution of representation where there's way more men politicians than women politicians in most countries, and that's not acceptable. And so they're actually going to bake into the system some kind of guarantee about the number of women politicians. So I think that's just one example from the physical world of something that could be done in Web3, where you could say, these are groups where it's just like table stakes that they get a say, because we think it's part of how we reflect our values and maintain our legitimacy as an organization, depending on what you're doing. And or these groups are essential for the economic growth of this thing, of this project. And so we need to make sure they believe that in the future, this thing is going to continue to work in their interests by making sure they're guaranteed representation. And so we're already seeing a bunch of forays into this in this direction. So there's been a bunch of energy around retroactive airdrops, which are essentially a way to work within the token voting system to try to facilitate representation for people making outsized contributions to the project. Then there's stuff that goes beyond that, like this optimism citizens house, where you're not just going to kind of try to alter the distribution of voting power within the kind of baseline token voting system, but you're actually going to create a separate unit of governance where membership and voting power is not a function of tokens held. And so the way that citizens house work, right, it's like a retroactive airdrop for people who contribute a lot to the community. But it's one identity, loosely defined, one vote in a separate chamber that makes decisions over funding public goods. And so this is another way of trying to guarantee that the people who contribute most to the project in different ways are going to together get to decide a certain set of issues around public goods, separate from the token holders. I think we could see stuff going beyond this. I think you can play with the system of delegation in interesting ways to kind of guarantee that different groups get representation. So thinking back to some of the motivating examples I had, imagine you're, building an app store for some new platform or something. You could guarantee the representation of developers in the decisions made by that app store. And even if the developers don't hold tokens, you give them voting power so that they feel like this app store is, making policy decisions in line with their interests. So those are some of the ideas there. I saw a couple of questions in the chats here. Let's see. I have not looked into the Cardano ecosystem, but I should. What do you think about copying the Swiss political system, having all interest groups in the delegated group and having the possibility for referendum? Yeah, I do think this is something we talk about a little bit. Porter and I talked about a little bit, and actually we have a new piece coming out that's going to talk a little bit about this. Is basically, how do you design the optimal constitution that has some amount of representation, but with this outside option on a core set of important things to go straight to the token holders for a vote? That could be like approving the budget every year. It could be other kinds of decisions. I think balancing the two is key, and I definitely think we need to explore that more. Here's a question here about blockchain protocol to decentralize the voting system itself. I'm interested in this. I think I'm very kind of having blinkered views of just being in the US. I think in the US this is pretty far from happening. because I think it's hard to, as you're pointing out in the question, there's a lot of mistrust of the US voting system in different ways on both sides, which is an enormous problem to the functioning of the system. But I think that anything technological we try to do in the short run is going to increase rather than decrease the mistrust. But I think in the long run, it seems plausible to me that, you know, well-designed and significantly battle-tested systems are likely to eventually take over. And I think we'll probably see that in other countries that are, you know, less sclerotic than the US will probably do it first. And of course, Estonia has been kind of at the forefront of some of this stuff. All right, let me try to finish up my slides in the interest of time here. Okay, the last part here is oversight. So we've already kind of alluded to this, but I think one of the things we're going to see as organizations get larger and where they have more money at stake is you're going to worry a lot, as you as a voter are going to worry a lot that kind of a bunch of stuff is going on within the system that you don't know about. You don't see it, you can't possibly know what's going on every day inside the system. And so it's going to generate mistrust. And if you don't feel like there's some accountability mechanism that's making sure that people taking decisions on a day-to-day basis are accountable, you're guaranteed to get mistrust. And we've seen this already in DAOs that have gotten larger. I don't know, for anyone who follows maker governance, this has been an issue for a while where you know, they've embarked on this incredible experiment in decentralized governance. They dissolved the foundation. And there's been a bunch of clashes around developing new, they call them core units, right? So like new units with more budget from the protocol to do different things. And whether or not those core units are doing a good job, I'm going to be completely agnostic on that for the purpose of this talk. It's very hard to generate trust in an environment where there isn't a super robust accountability mechanism that's like credibly telling everyone, you know, these units are doing what we want them to do and the budget that they're getting is in proportion to what they're doing. And I think what we'll see in a mature system is something like the core units, but with this extra layer of oversight that is essential, not to change what the core units are already doing necessarily, maybe they're already doing a great job, but simply to reassure everyone else that what is going on is in accordance with what they want. That's how you get trust. Sort of this like old saying, trust but verify. You need that system of oversight to get everyone to trust each other. And it's very hard to actually pull this off. And of course, we see this in real governments all the time. This has been for a long time a huge debate in the US. It's very, very similar. There's a very large government that does a ton of different things, many of which are super, super important. And there's a general sense that it's really hard to know what they're up to. And so a big goal of government is to try to create effective oversight mechanisms so that voters could trust that what the bureaucracy is doing is in their interests. And the US has largely not succeeded in generating that trust, but some other countries have. So how can you do that in a decentralized organization? I'll just mention a few ideas here and then I'll leave the talk here. You could ask the delegates to, you know, if you get this more robust system of delegation with strong accountability, you could ask the delegates directly to do some oversight. You could also ask them to help, you know, build a system of oversight through a committee. That would be similar to corporate governance. And you need to resource and staff that oversight committee in an effective way. And then as I was alluding to before, you could also have, you know, a smaller number, but an important set of referendums that go back to the token holders at large. So you could have something where it's like, there's a committee that oversees what the workforce is doing and reports back to token holders. And then once a year or whatever, there's a vote on the recommendations of that committee and then a vote to approve the budget and so forth. And so these are some of the ideas. I'm gonna leave it here because I'm basically at time and I think there's just a few last questions maybe in the chat, but these are sort of just like, I think, 3 groups of hopefully somewhat practical ideas that a DAO or another decentralized organization could try to implement that try to combine, I think, ideas or learnings from the last, 2,000 years of democratic governance in the physical world with some of the technology that blockchain enables. And so I'm super excited to talk more. I hope you'll feel free to reach out to me. I think my info is available. If it's not, maybe I'll just type it into the chat here if I can. This is my email. And this is my, oops, I just typed it wrong, but this is my Twitter. And yeah, would love to stay in touch and hear more. Thank you for all the great questions, and look forward to talking more with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Professor Han, for your fantastic talk. I took a lot of notes. Yeah, I will think about that and how to implement this from the technology side. Yeah, and thanks again. I think maybe we still have a few questions from in our chat.
Great. Yeah, I hope everyone will feel free to reach out, and thank you for all the questions. This is great. All right.
Okay, thank you again, Jonathan, Professor Hall, and I think this is we hope that this event is just the beginning of the collaboration between you and Blockchain UBC. And at Blockchain UBC, we host a lot of the events, and we have collaborations with scholars all over the world. Yeah, so in the future, I look forward to more collaborations.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was awesome.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.